Okay, so Rome wasn't European. I know, that sounds like a pretty bold claim. We're all taught to think of Rome as, the very bedrock of European civilization. But what if that huge assumption we all make is actually wrong? Well, today we're going to challenge it.
What if those neat little boxes we put everyone into, the Greeks, the Romans, the Europeans, what if they're actually hiding a much more interesting, much more connected story? That's the real question we're diving into. And the answer? Well, it just might change how you see everything. So, how do we do that? Well, we're going to stop focusing on the usual story of nations, flags, and different ethnic groups. Instead, we're going to look at history more like a scientist. We're going to analyze the invisible operating systems that truly define a society. I'm talking about its laws, its trade networks, its shared culture, the stuff running in the background.
And to really put this new way of thinking to the test, we're going to look at two powerful and totally contrasting examples. First, we'll see how ancient societies we always think of as separate were, in fact, basically one and the same. Then we'll jump to a society that we assume is continuous and see how it completely, and I mean completely, reinvented itself.
Okay, let's start in the ancient world. For a minute, I want you to just forget the modern borders of Italy, Greece, or Lebanon. We have to try and see this region for what it really was back then, a single, deeply connected world.
So here's the main idea. The Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, they weren't just neighbors living next to each other. You can actually see them as different phases of the same big Mediterranean civilization, all running on a remarkably similar operating system. Let's dig into the evidence for that.
First off, their entire world was defined by water. For them, the Mediterranean Sea wasn't some kind of barrier. It was a superhighway. See, the land was full of these rugged mountains that made travel incredibly difficult. But the sea connected everyone and everything. It wasn't just a feature of their world. It was the absolute center of it.
And that, of course, leads directly to the second shared pattern, their economy. Not a single one of these societies could survive on its own. They were all built on this massive network of exchange. From Phoenician merchants to the Greek city-states, all the way to the Roman Empire. Every one of them was fundamentally dependent on long-distance sea trade just to survive.
This shared system went right down to the most basic part of life, what people ate. That famous trio of grain, olive oil, and wine, that wasn't just some cultural thing. It was a direct result of their shared environment. This common diet became the actual backbone of their trade and their daily lives across the entire sea.
And what's really cool is you can watch this single system evolve over centuries. The Phoenicians kind of built the initial framework, then the Greeks came in and expanded and diversified it, and then the Romans just perfected the whole thing, creating one massive integrated market across the entire basin. It was only much later, after 400 CE, that this unified world finally fractured, splitting into the separate European and Middle Eastern civilizations that we think of today.
All right, let's jump way forward in time and all the way across the globe. Our second case study shows what happens when a civilization intentionally decides to change its own operating system. And for that, we're going to Japan. The common story is that modern Japan just sort of evolved from old samurai Japan. But if we actually analyze those underlying systems, we don't find a smooth evolution at all. We find a violent break, a change so complete and so rapid that it basically produced an entirely new society.
Let's just start with the law. In Edo, Japan, your social status was the law. Simple as that. In Meiji, Japan, that was gone. Law became universal, written down, and based on Western models. The entire goal shifted from just maintaining a rigid social order to actually protecting individual rights in commerce. It was a completely different philosophy of what justice even is.
You see the same radical shift in their economy. Edo, Japan had all these local markets and merchant guilds. Meiji Japan built a unified global economy. They created huge corporations, they laid down railways, they put up telegraph lines. Look, they didn't just upgrade their economy, they replaced the entire engine.
And maybe this is the most important part. They changed how people thought. Education in Edo, Japan was mostly for the elite, focused on Confucian classics. Meiji education became universal and compulsory, and it taught Western science and arts. And the goal? Well, the goal was to consciously install a brand new mental operating system in the entire population.
But the change went even deeper, right into the most private parts of people's lives. For example, there were traditional practices like yobai, which was a form of nighttime courtship common in rural Japan. Well, it was systematically suppressed. Why? Because it didn't line up with the strict Victorian morals Japan wanted to project to the West. So this wasn't just policy, this was a fundamental reshaping of culture and morality.
There's a quote that just sums it all up perfectly. The institutional DNA of Japan changed so profoundly that it effectively produced a new people. I mean, they didn't just modernize, they fundamentally transformed who they were.
So we've seen a unified world that we thought was separate, and we've seen a single nation that basically became two different societies. After looking at these two stories, what's the big takeaway? What even is a civilization, really?
Well, here it is. A civilization isn't about your bloodline or the lines on a map. It's really about the shared software a society runs on, those deep systems of law, commerce, and culture that dictate how everything actually works.
And really think about what that means. It means civilizations aren't these static, fixed identities that we're just born into. They're much more like operating systems. Systems that societies learn, adopt, and, as Japan proved, can even consciously decide to replace entirely.
And that brings us to one last, really profound question. If a civilization is just a learned system, what is our system? And who are we if we decide to change it?